October 2014 meeting of the Federal Communications Commission will come to order. Madam Secretary, you're looking well this morning. Will you please give us the lineup for the day?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning to you and good morning, Commissioners. Today's agenda includes 3 items for your consideration and 1 presentation. First, you will consider a report and order that takes critical steps to promote the deployment of wireless infrastructure necessary to provide the public with ubiquitous, advanced wireless broadband services. Second, you will consider a notice of inquiry to explore innovative developments in the use of spectrum above 24 gigahertz for mobile wireless services and how the Commission can facilitate the development and deployment of those technologies. Third, you will consider a second further notice of proposed rulemaking to comprehensively reform interstate and intrastate inmate calling services to ensure just, reasonable, and fair rates and charges for consumers as well as providers. Fourth, you will hear a presentation regarding an inquiry into a major 911 service outage that affected 7 states in April 2014. The presentation will include findings from a report on the causes and effects of the outage, as well as recommendations on actions the industry, the Commission, and state governments can take to strengthen the reliability and resiliency of 911 services as the nation transitions to next generation 911. This is your agenda for today. Please note that item 3, listed on the Commission's Sunshine Notice released October 10, 2014, was adopted by the Commission and deleted from today's agenda. The first item today will be presented by the Wireless Telecommunications Bureau. Roger Sherman, Chief of the Bureau, will give the introduction.
Thank you very much, Madam Secretary. Chief, fire away.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman and Commissioners. It's my pleasure to introduce this report and order, which takes critical steps to promote deployment of the wireless infrastructure necessary to provide the public with ubiquitous advanced wireless broadband services. This order is the Commission's most recent effort to facilitate wireless broadband deployment. In August, the Commission adopted a report and order reforming tower lighting and marking requirements, significantly easing compliance burdens for tower owners while promoting aircraft navigation safety. Also during the summer, the Wireless Bureau initiated discussions with various stakeholders to address additional measures we can take to expedite review processes and encourage co-locations on existing towers. In particular, we intend to tailor further our historic preservation review process by implementing federal review procedures that are more appropriately tailored for DAS and small cell wireless deployments. And just last month, the Bureau launched a new effort to potentially make more sites, sometimes referred to as twilight towers, available for co-locations by bringing already constructed facilities into compliance. The Bureau is devoting significant time and resources to these efforts and will continue to focus on ways we can encourage high-speed deployment. The team that has led the charge on today's report and order is with me at the table. I am joined by Chad Breckenridge, Associate Bureau Chief for the Wireless Bureau, Peter Trachtenberg, Deputy Chief for the Spectrum and Competition Policy Division, and 3 colleagues from the Spectrum and Competition Policy Division, Attorney Advisor Juan Kim, Attorney Advisor Manya Baghdadi, and Program Analyst Michael Smith. I would also like to thank Joel Taubenblatt, Jeff Steinberg, Jennifer Flynn, Monica DeLong, Soroup Chabra, Don Johnson, Ivy Harris, Marasha Younger, Shade Oshanubi, Stephen Del Sordo, and Patty Robbins in the Wireless Bureau for their work on this item, as well as the Office of Native Affairs and Policy, the Enforcement Bureau, the Media Bureau, the Public Safety and Homeland Security Bureau, the Wireline Competition Bureau, and the Office of General Counsel for their help in reviewing and refining the draft. Finally, we've also worked collaboratively with the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation and the Council on Environmental Quality in connection with some aspects of this item, and we are grateful for their contributions. Peter Trachtenberg will present the item.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman and Commissioners. This morning we are pleased to present a report and order that promotes the deployment of wireless infrastructure. The order takes action in 5 key areas. First, the order examines the FCC's rules regarding federal environmental review of wireless facility deployments under the National Environmental Policy Act, commonly known as NEPA. The order expands an existing exclusion for co-locations so that it applies not only to co-locations on buildings and towers, but also on other structures like utility poles. In addition, the order adopts a new exclusion from environmental review under NEPA for deployments in utilities and communications rights-of-way in active use, where there is no substantial increase in size over existing utility and communications uses. Second, the order addresses federal historic preservation review under Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act. The order adopts new exclusions to address co-locations where the deployment would have no effect on historic characteristics of the structure because of size limitations, a lack of ground disturbance, and other limiting factors. These new exclusions do not apply to co-locations in historic districts or on structures that are listed or eligible for listing in the National Register of Historic Places. The order also commits to developing a broader program alternative in consultation with tribal nations, the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation, and state historic preservation officers to promote additional efficiencies for DAS and small cell deployments. Third, the order adopts rules to implement Section 649A of the Middle Class Tax Relief and Job Creation Act of 2012, which provides that state and local governments may not deny and shall approve an eligible request for modification of an existing wireless tower or base station that does not substantially change its physical dimensions. The order defines key terms and clarifies review procedures and remedies, including a fixed deadline for state or local action and a deemed granted remedy where a state or local jurisdiction fails to act within the required time frame. The order also explains that states and localities may continue to enforce compliance with general building, structural, electrical, and safety codes, and with other objective, non-discretionary laws related to health and safety. Fourth, the order addresses Section 332C7 of the Communications Act, which provides that local governments must act on personal wireless service facilities siting requests in a reasonable period of time. The order clarifies the operation of the time frames that the Commission adopted in its 2009 declaratory ruling interpreting the provision. Finally, the order codifies an existing waiver for temporary towers. As a result, the towers that meet the defined criteria, including limits on the size and duration of the installation, are not subject to the 30-day advance notice requirement otherwise included as a part of the federal environmental review process. In sum, this report and order furthers the Commission's ongoing efforts to facilitate the deployment of broadband infrastructure while preserving the ability of states, local jurisdictions, and tribal nations to protect their land use priorities as well as aesthetic and safety interests. The Wireless Telecommunications Bureau recommends that the Commission adopt this report and order and requests editorial privileges. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Trachtenberg. Commissioner Clyburn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. When considering how best to help wireless companies meet the explosive consumer demand for mobile services, the FCC focuses a lot on its upcoming AWS-3 and incentive auctions. The reality is that in order to meet our ever-growing communications needs, carriers cannot just acquire spectrum. They must also deploy that spectrum using a hardened, robust mobile infrastructure, which includes antennas and base stations. Too often, the process of obtaining the necessary approvals from federal, state, and local governments to deploy can be both expensive and time-consuming. Today's order seeks to address these shortcomings by bringing about more efficiency to the process of approving wireless facilities. Since 1974, the FCC's environmental and historic review procedures have excluded co-locations of antennas from most of the requirements, recognizing the benefits of using existing structures over constructing new ones. Today, in order to facilitate faster deployment of wireless infrastructure, we expand that categorical exclusion to include equipment associated with the antennas, such as wires, cables, and backup power equipment, utility poles, and electric transmission towers that meet certain conditions and co-locations within a building. We also adopt a 60-day period of review, before a co-location application can be deemed granted pursuant to Section 6409A of the Middle Class Tax Relief and Job Creation Act of 2012. I was able to support this time period for two reasons. First, my colleagues agreed to move the effective date for the rules adopted here from 30 to 90 days after the Federal Register publication. Second, last night, CTIA and PCIA agreed to make a number of commitments that could help resource-constrained municipalities transition to the new streamlined rules we are adopting today. Specifically, those associations will work in good faith toward the following goals: informing resource-constrained municipalities of best practices used by other jurisdictions that are able to review and approve applications in fewer than 60 days. Providing webinars and contacts that provide education and assistance to these municipalities regarding the application process. Providing assistance in drafting a model ordinance and application for reviewing eligible facilities requests under Section 6409A, and creating a checklist that government officials may use to help streamline the review process. I commend those organizations for making these commitments. By making these changes to our rules, we anticipate spurring greater deployment of new technologies, such as small cells and distributed antenna systems, which multiply wireless capacity within existing spectrum resources. For example, deploying 10 small cells in a coverage area that can be served by a single microcell could result in a 10-fold increase in capacity. Small cells can also be deployed relatively easily on utility poles, street lamps, water towers, or rooftops like yours, Mr. Chairman, a reason why they're becoming so popular. We also adopt an exemption from the rule that tower owners must give the public 30 days notice to comment on a proposed tower's potential effects to the environment and to historic sites. This exemption applies only to proposed temporary towers that meet certain criteria. Specifically, those towers must be in use for 60 days or less, be shorter than 200 feet in height, involve minimal or no excavation, and not require FAA marking or lighting. This exemption will allow communications companies to respond more effectively to emergencies and other planned or unplanned short-term spikes in demand. Finally, Mr. Chairman, I wish to thank Roger Sherman, Chad Breckenridge, Patty Robbins, Peter Trachtenberg, Juan Kim, Manya Baghdadi, and Michael Smith, as well as my wireless advisor, Louis Perez, for providing us with such an excellent item. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Clyburn. Commissioner Rosenworcel.
Thanks. If you want a wireless revolution, you need an evolution in infrastructure. And mindful of this truth, today the Commission significantly evolves its policies for wireless facility siting. That means we streamline many aspects of our tower siting rules to help encourage the deployment of wireless infrastructure. But what we do today goes well beyond traditional towers. That's because the rules we put in place here are our first steps to encourage deployment of infrastructure that is absolutely critical for the next generation of wireless service, 5G. This is a good thing because the race to 5G is on. And in the next generation of wireless networks, traffic will change. We will see more data traveling wirelessly than ever before, between people and machines, and between machines themselves. To accommodate all of this traffic, we will need to look anew at spectrum that is way, way up there, well beyond our traditional 3 gigahertz boundary for mobile broadband. But the physics of these far-off frequencies are different. They have smaller waves multiplying our need for antenna systems. That means we need different infrastructure here on the ground. That means exploring new technologies like massive multiple input, multiple output antenna arrays and het nets that could change how we think today about network topology. That means we need to start with new policies to support deployment of distributed antenna systems and small cells. And because that's a critical part of what we do here today, I am pleased to support it. Now, some revolutions begin with a bang, but this one here started with the heavy lift of hard work. So thank you to the Wireless Telecommunications Bureau for your efforts to evolve our wireless siting policies and for your commitment to support infrastructure deployment with this generation of technology and the next.
Thank you, Commissioner, and thank you for relating both of these items and how they're depend on each other. So, good point. Commissioner Pai.
Removing barriers to wireless infrastructure has been one of my top priorities since joining the Commission. 2 years ago, I laid out a plan to do just that. It called on the Commission to modernize our environmental and historic preservation rules by exempting most distributed antenna systems, or DAS, and small cell technologies, to curb local moratoria on the approval of new infrastructure, and to make clear that our shot clock rules apply to DAS and small cells. 5 months ago, I reiterated those proposals and urged the Commission to adopt a deemed grant remedy for violations of Section 6409 of the Spectrum Act, as well as objective standards for determining the types of modifications that qualify for treatment under that section. Now, I'll be the first to admit that wireless infrastructure isn't always the most glamorous issue. Discussing categorical exclusions under the National Environmental Policy Act isn't as exciting as thinking about multi-billion-dollar spectrum auctions. But wireless infrastructure is just as important as spectrum. Consider one figure, $35 billion. That's how much, on average, wireless operators are expected to invest on an annual basis in mobile broadband infrastructure. And that translates into hundreds of towers, thousands of base stations, and a vast network of microcells, picocells, and DAS, not to mention high-paying quality jobs across the country. And with today's order, we are going to stretch all of those dollars even farther. That will mean broader coverage, greater capacity, and ultimately, better wireless broadband service for consumers. It's a simple relationship, really. Lower costs mean greater deployment. But for far too long, and in far too many places, a web of municipal, state, and federal regulations have entangled those trying to build infrastructure. Delays, needless paperwork, and moratoria all mean higher costs and accordingly less deployment. Additionally, many of these regulations ignore the realities of modern wireless technology. So some places still apply the rules for constructing a 200-foot tower to swapping out a 3G antenna for a 4G one. And that disserves the public interest. And if left in place, rules like this could delay the use of the AWS-3 and 600 megahertz spectrum that we soon will be auctioning off. And it will slow the build-out of FirstNet. That's why I'm very pleased that we are removing some of those barriers today, and I'm grateful that the order includes many of my initial proposals. For example, the order amends our environmental and historic preservation rules to make it easier to deploy small cells and to co-locate antennas on existing structures. The order also makes it clear that our shot clock rules apply to small cells and DAS, and that local moratoria cannot be used to make an end run around those rules. And it adopts a bright line test for determining which equipment modifications qualify for Section 6409's deemed grant remedy. And it makes clear that an applicant can start building on day 61 if a municipality doesn't act on its application by day 60. These are no small changes. At the end of the day, America's consumers stand to benefit in a big way. Today's order will make it easier for carriers, large and small, to maintain, to upgrade, and to expand their coverage and their capacity. I'd also like to thank my colleagues for agreeing to accept some of my suggested changes that have improved the item. For example, the order now provides greater relief to those seeking to deploy small cell technology by expanding the permitted size of co-locations that qualify under the categorical exclusions that we adopt today. Similarly, the order now provides that cabling and other non-telecom equipment don't count against providers when they co-locate on a utility structure. And I appreciate the order's discussion of the benefit of injunctive relief in cases where localities don't comply with the FCC's shot clock. Additionally, I would like to thank Commissioner O'Reilly in particular for the important role he played in securing other positive changes to the item. Now, critically, the actions we take today lie well within the scope of our statutory authority. For example, in both Section 332C7 of the Communications Act and Section 6409 of the Spectrum Act, Congress has clearly and specifically granted the Commission the power to remove barriers to wireless infrastructure deployment. Now, moving forward, there's still more to be done. In 18 to 24 months, but I hope sooner, we'll have a new programmatic agreement that will further streamline the process for deploying small cell technologies. And once we have some experience in the field with a deemed grant remedy for infrastructure deployment, I hope we consider extending that remedy to our Section 332 shot clock. But none of this is to obscure the fact that today's order is a solid step in the right direction. Last, but certainly not least, I'd like to thank the FCC's talented staff for all of their hard work on this item. Roger Sherman, Maniam Baghdadi, Chad Breckenridge, Saurabh Chabra, Monica DeLong, Stephen Del Sordo, Jennifer Flynn, Ivy Harris, David Horowitz, Don Johnson, Elisa Katz, Juan Kim, Lee Martin, Shadhay Oshinubi, Bill Richardson, Patty Robbins, Michael Smith, Jeff Steinberg, Joel Tabenblatt, Peter Trachtenberg, and Ramasha Younger. And I also want to acknowledge the dedicated efforts that PCIA, including my friend and former Commissioner Jonathan Adelstein, in attendance today, CTIA, and many players in the infrastructure industry have made to bring these critical issues to the fore. Finding ways to make it easier to deploy wireless infrastructure is not the easiest or most glamorous of tasks, but it is essential so that all Americans, wherever they live, can enjoy in the bounty of wireless broadband. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner O'Reilly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I am very pleased to support the item before us to facilitate the deployment of wireless infrastructure. It is disappointing, however, that we had to go to such great lengths to get to where we are today. But that is not a slight on the Chairman or the Commission. By way of background, Section 704 of the Telecommunications Act of 1996 was designed to ensure a thoughtful process to deal with disagreements between local and state governments and wireless communications providers. Many weeks of negotiation between interested parties resulted in a statutory provision that many thought provided a reasonable compromise and outcome. It balanced the market demands of wireless companies and then their then predominantly voice consumers with the interests of localities. Unfortunately, as soon as the ink was dry on the Telecom Act, some state and local governments went to work to undermine and in some cases completely ignore the siting provisions in the statute. The same entities that previously struck a deal to continued to impede the placement of wireless towers in their jurisdictions. We saw some impose siting moratoria, claiming that such restrictions were not a violation of the statute. We saw some localities stretch out zoning meetings for months, require excessive documentation, intentionally delay decisions, fail to provide written rejections based on the facts, and generally do everything possible to maintain barriers to siting. And the scope of the blocking did not just focus on larger or new towers. It also extended to adjustments or additions of antennas to existing towers. I've observed for years of the court filings and cases containing weak arguments as to why action on a particular siting application was unnecessary or required. On point, the Supreme Court is expected to soon consider what qualifies as in writing under the statute and the timing for provisions for providing the reasons for denying an application. Is it really too much to ask for a locality to provide written justification for denying an application at the same time it provides the reasons for denying the application? Or for a locality to spell out the exact reasons for a denial? Must an applicant get a denial one day and be forced to fish through the record issued on another to find the exact reasons? Of course not. Such disruptive practices did not go unnoticed. After years of excuses, Congress acted, as the President mentioned in the presentation, as what is commonly referred to as the Spectrum Act. The provisions of law which we act upon today provide extensive responses to lessons learned from the practices of certain state and local governments. The overall message delivered was, the gig is up. Congress provided what I believe to be a very clear direction to remove barriers to the siting, installation, and modification process. The benefits of today's item will be great, and our action is essential to the development of the future of wireless communications. As data continues to grow annually at a furious pace, more wireless infrastructure is needed to carry such traffic and deploy new wireless services. By removing specific practices that are unnecessary obstacles, simplifying numerous provisions in our rules, and providing clarity on exactly how the Commission will implement the statutory provisions, we set the stage for an easier wireless antenna siting process. This will facilitate the hundreds of thousands of sightings in the future and greatly expand wireless service capacity and coverage. To put this in perspective, comments in the record by PCA suggest that one provider is in the process of trying to deploy 10,000 new macro cells, 40,000 small cells, and 1,000 distributed antenna systems. Our action today is especially important for unlicensed spectrum use in small cell and DAS siting. The growth of unlicensed use and small cells means more wireless infrastructure is going to be needed. Simply put, we're going to need more towers and more antennas and fewer legal obstacles by state and local governments. More importantly, we need to keep in mind the types of wireless communications that can be aided by our action. As we know from other proceedings, today's wireless devices are used to communicate in times of emergency, keep in touch with friends and family, expand broadband options for an array of people, among other purposes. The Commission must remain focused on the needs of the American consumer. Lastly, let me be clear that I see a great deal of difference between today's action and the effort to override state and local protections on municipal-owned or operated networks. The most important distinction is that Congress spoke directly and clearly to wireless infrastructure, but not to muni broadband. Over the years, there have been numerous efforts in Congress to address the muni broadband issue, but those efforts were never enacted. I want to thank the chairman for moving this item and for accepting so many of my edits. Been so thoughtful. I also want to thank WTB and all of their good people, which my colleagues have done as well. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Commissioner O'Reilly, and to all my colleagues for your unanimous support of this item. Obviously, we all strongly agree on its importance. If the 21st century is going to be the wireless century, there's only two ways that we can deal with the increase in demand. One is more spectrum, and the other is spectrum reuse. Both of those require siting. They're responsibilities that the Congress has established for us, and the responsibilities that localities have abut each other. And so what we have done here is work through that abuttal, if there is such a word, and establish what the processes are to make sure that we are both fulfilling our responsibilities. And that responsibility is first to our constituents, the American people, and their right to have a vibrant and growing broadband infrastructure. I want to commend Commissioner Clyburn for her creative ex parte on bringing together the folks to talk about one specific circumstance that we did not talk about here. And with that, I will call for the vote. All in favor, say aye. Aye. Opposed? The ayes have it. The request for editorial privileges is granted. And before everybody leaves, Michael, Mania, Juan, I'm going to skip you for a second. Shad, Roger, thank you very much. But Peter Trachtenberg can now go home and go to sleep. Okay? Because the reality is that this gentleman has been literally working night and day to make this happen. And Peter, you're worthy of a shout out. Everybody deserves all the effort, but Peter, thanks for your effort. We give you a special shout out. Thank you. Okay, Madam Secretary.
Mr. Chairman and Commissioners, the second item will be presented by the Office of Engineering and Technology and the Wireless Telecommunications Bureau. It is entitled Use of Spectrum Bands Above the 24 Gigahertz Band for Mobile Radio Services.
Julie, you driving? Roger's driving.
Roger.
Take it away again. You did such a good job last time. You know, you got
Mr. Chairman and Commissioners, it's my pleasure to introduce this notice of inquiry, which would initiate a proceeding to help the Commission better understand the state of the art in technologies that enable mobile wireless service and frequencies above 24 gigahertz. We will use the information gathered through this NOI to ensure we foster a regulatory environment in which these technologies can flourish. I'm joined at the table by Julie Knapp, Chief of the Office of Engineering and Technology, Blaise Cinto, Chief of the Wireless Bureau's Broadband Division, John Schaubel, Deputy Chief of the Broadband Division, Charlie Oliver, an attorney in the Broadband Division, and Michael Ha, Deputy Chief of the Policy and Rules Division in OET. In addition to the team at the table, I would like to thank the staff of the Wireless Bureau, OET, the International Bureau, and the Office of General Counsel for their expert contributions to this NOI. Michael and Charlie will present the item.
Great. Thank you.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, Commissioners.
Morning.
I'm pleased to present to you today the Spectrum Frontiers Notice of Inquiry, an item that will begin a proceeding examining the state of the art in technological developments that could enable the use of a millimeter wave spectrum above 24 gigahertz for mobile wireless services. Today, mobile wireless services are generally targeted at bands below 3 gigahertz due to technological and practical limitations. However, there have been significant developments in antenna and processing technologies that may allow the use of higher frequencies for mobile applications. These technologies may result in dramatically greater throughput and data rates than technologies used in existing mobile wireless frequencies. In December 2013, the Technological Advisory Council recommended the Commission issue a notice of inquiry to examine the potential for the provision of mobile services in bands above 30 gigahertz. The notice of inquiry before you would implement that recommendation of the TAC and expand upon it to include bands above 24 gigahertz. Charlie will describe the details of this notice of inquiry.
Good morning.
Morning.
The TAC based its recommendation that the Commission initiate this NOI after reviewing research on advanced technologies that could make it possible to ricochet line-of-sight signals around intervening obstacles on frequencies that are far higher than the frequencies where mobile services operate today at much higher data transmission rates. Each receiver would detect multiple reflections of an original signal, gather them together, align them, add them up to reveal intelligible data. As a result, spectrum that is currently only effective for line-of-sight communications could be used for mobile communications. The objective of the NOI is to gain a greater understanding of these technologies under development and examine steps to create an even-handed regulatory regime that would allow a wide variety of technologies to flourish in response to market demand. The NOI has three main sections: technology, frequency bands, and licensing mechanisms. The technology section seeks comment on technologies, network architectures, and operational challenges. It asks how our existing technical rules can be adapted and applied to mobile use of the millimeter wave bands, and asks what protections will be necessary to avoid causing harmful interference to incumbent services. In the frequency band section, the notice seeks comment on the suitability of a series of bands above 24 gigahertz for mobile use. The notice explains the existing allocations, incumbent uses, and intensity of use in these bands. The NOI also seeks comment on whether other services, in addition to mobile wireless services and incumbent microwave services, could be deployed in these bands. Finally, the licensing mechanism section of the notice seeks comment on a variety of licensing mechanisms, including exclusive use of geographic licensing via auction, a non-exclusive mechanisms where conflicts are resolved by a frequency coordination, including concepts similar to those in the 3.5 gigahertz proceeding, unlicensed, and hybrid mechanisms. The Office of Engineering and Technology and the Wireless Telecommunications Bureau recommend adoption of this item and seek editorial privileges. Thank you.
Thank you, Charles, Michael, and to everybody for their efforts on this. Commissioner Clyburn.
All trends point to an ever-increasing demand for advanced wireless services, which means that we need to both promote efficient uses and reallocate more spectrum for commercial benefits. Since reallocation of sufficient spectrum to meet the wireless needs is a multi-year process, the time to start planning for our mobile future is now. While many wireless carriers are in the midst of deploying 4G networks, the industry is already calling for a fifth generation that will substantially exceed the capacity of existing mobile technologies. While there is no consensus on the definition of 5G, some believe it would accommodate an eventual 1,000-fold increase in traffic demand and support high bandwidth content with speeds in excess of 10 gigabits per second. Achieving these objectives will likely require the development of new networks that will deliver service through multiple widely spaced frequency bands using microcells, macrocells, unlicensed as well as licensed transceivers. While some companies agree there is room for further efficiency gains in the bands below 3 gigahertz, they generally believe that the provision of 5G level service will require use of higher frequency bands, such as those above 24 gigahertz. In planning for the future use of bands above 24 gigahertz, we need a better understanding of those state-of-the-art and potential future developments and technology, for it will require us to study the best ways to manage interference among operators and other licensees that operate in the same or adjacent bands. And of course, we want to spur creative ideas for the best licensing and authorization blueprints on mobile operations above 24 gigahertz. So I commend the chairman for starting the process with this notice of inquiry and thank Roger Sherman, Julie Knapp, and their staffs, including Michael, Charles, Blaze, and John, in the Wireless Telecommunications Bureau, and of course the Office of Engineering and Technology for presenting such a thoughtful item. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Rosenworcel.
The United States leads the world in 4G LTE deployments. While we are home to less than 5% of the globe's population, we have nearly half of all LTE subscriptions worldwide. And the world has taken note. I can say this with confidence because just last week I was in Austria, where I represented the United States at the annual gathering of the International Institute of Communications. So I was able to sit down in Vienna with colleagues from around the world and talk over some spectacularly strong coffee. It's like jet fuel. About what we have accomplished here on our shores. And we can be proud, but we also have more work to do, because it's true what they say. Laurels are not, in fact, good resting places. We need to think beyond our success with 4G service, because the race to 5G is on. And look around, the evidence is here. Slowly but surely, the world's wireless economies are planning for 5G. Last year, South Korea announced plans to run its first 5G trials by the time it hosts the Winter Olympics. That's just 3 years away. Not to be outdone, Japan's Ministry of Internal Affairs and Communications announced that it hopes to roll out 5G service in a number of cities by 2020. And that's the year that Tokyo hosts the Summer Olympics. Other parts of the world, including those without the Olympics, have stepped up their efforts too. Earlier this year, the European Commission entered into a cooperative agreement with South Korea. They plan to work together on a global definition of 5G service and cooperate on 5G research. Meanwhile, last year in China, 3 of the nation's ministries jointly established a group to promote the development of 5G technologies. So we have signs. We have signs that the rest of the world is on the road to 5G. And there's no reason for the United States to stay stuck in the starting gate. We need to build on our 4G success and get going right now. The good news is that today's notice of inquiry, combined with our report and order on wireless facility siting, represents a starting gun. We are off. We are thinking about the spectrum and infrastructure policies that best support next-generation networks. Now, in our current generation of wireless networks, we focus on spectrum from 600 megahertz to 3 gigahertz. That's the sweet spot today for mobile communications. But in the future, it could look different, very different. That's because we are moving from networks designed for analog voice to networks designed for high-speed digital data. And to keep up with escalating demand, our next-generation networks are going to have to do some heavy lifting. They will need to accommodate more traffic coming from more devices at higher rates. At the same time, they will need to lower latency and conserve power to extend battery life. Well, that sounds easy, doesn't it? So how are we going to meet these demands? Well, we look up, way, way up, to infinity and beyond. We need to bust through our old 3 gigahertz ceiling, and let's take a look at spectrum all the way up in the 60 gigahertz range and maybe all the way to 90 gigahertz. At these ranges, we can aggregate spectrum and allow data-intensive applications to ride across hundreds of megahertz at a time. But these stratospheric frequencies can mean more than just wide channels. That's because the physics here are different. It means real propagation challenges, sure, but also new opportunities to think about 5G network topology. Because if you mix those wide channels with small cells packed close together, you can densify our networks at much lower cost. This in turn can mean service that reaches further into buildings at faster speeds than ever before, especially in fast-growing areas with the greatest traffic demands. Now, to take advantage of these millimeter waves will require thinking through some novel technical and policy issues. And at the same time, we will need to continue to work to secure spectrum for commercial use below 3 gigahertz. But if we do both right, we will take our leadership in 4G service and leverage it into the emerging world of 5G service. So, let's get out of the gate, let's get going, and make it happen. So thank you to OET and WTB.
Thank you, Commissioner. Maybe we should rename this the Buzz Lightyear item. Commissioner Pai.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Today's notice of inquiry examines a possibility that many people thought impossible not long ago. And I'm not referring to my team, the chairman's team, the Kansas City Royals, ending their 29-year playoff drought and making it to the World Series. No, I took the liberties of assuming that it's got to be under our ancillary authority, right?
Is this a delegated authority issue that you have assumed for yourself? Is this what's going on?
It works for me.
Okay.
No, I'm talking about something even more impressive, and that is using spectrum above 24 gigahertz for mobile broadband. To put this in perspective, consider that existing mobile technologies rely almost exclusively on spectrum below 3 gigahertz. But over the past year, organizations around the world have been exploring the use of bands above 24 gigahertz as a part of a broader effort to develop 5G mobile technologies. Commercial deployment of 5G offerings could begin in just 6 years. And while there is no consensus definition of 5G today, many expect that it will provide speeds ranging from 1 to 10 gigabits per second. And to support those speeds, we will need to find wide, contiguous channels. And a prime location could be in bands above 24 gigahertz. By seeking comment now on the potential use of these bands, we will help ensure that our nation continues to lead the world in mobile wireless when the time comes to transition to 5G technologies. Hopefully, today's NOI will also encourage companies to continue to research and to develop options for deploying 5G offerings here in the United States. Next week, I look forward to having the chance to see some of these efforts firsthand when I visit Samsung's labs in Texas. There, researchers are developing 5G base and mobile technologies that use spectrum above 24 gigahertz. Finally, I'd like to thank my colleagues for agreeing to expand today's notice to include a number of additional bands, including those above 86 gigahertz. It's important that we consider all bands that might be useful for mobile broadband technologies. This item has my full support, and I'll be voting to approve. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for teeing up this important issue, and thanks to the staff of OET and WTB for their excellent analysis of these complicated issues.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner O'Reilly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The beauty of today's notice of inquiry is that no one in this room knows where it'll eventually take us. Which spectrum bands above 24 gigahertz will be effectively used in the short term, over the long term? Will the technologies be mobile or fixed, unlicensed or licensed? What equipment will be necessary to utilize these bands? Only research, testing, and time will tell. Commercial use of high band or millimeter wave spectrum provides a host of opportunities and challenges to our technology developers, including technical hurdles and the constraint of physics. I look forward to exploring with interested stakeholders the potential of these bands, while also recognizing the incumbents already using these frequencies. At its heart, the item expands our search for additional spectrum to meet America's mobile needs, especially wireless broadband technologies. Two important data points that highlight this: the growth in monthly mobile data and the growth in mobile connected devices. Consumer demand for faster wireless speeds is also exceptionally clear. My colleague, Commissioner Rosenworcel, has been outspoken in the last few weeks on the need to open these frequencies to additional commercial wireless uses, and she is correct. The bands in the higher gigasphere represent an untapped ocean of possibility for wireless usage. The Commission cannot sit idly by and start our search for future commercial bands only when the need arises. That is too late. We must move forward to figure out what is next in the spectrum pipeline. If I had one pause, however, it is that some people refer to these bands as 5G. The truth is that 5G wireless technologies are likely to use many spectrum bands and may or may not include these millimeter wave frequencies. As the item recognizes, there is no consensus definition of 5G. It would be wise to sharpen our lexicon ever so slightly going forward. I want to thank the chairman for initiating this proceeding, and WTB and OET and my colleagues, and I'm happy to support it. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner O'Reilly. We spoke a minute ago about the need for more spectrum, and this obviously opens an inquiry to address that need for new high-frequency spectrum. It's, as has been pointed out, a recommendation of the Technology Advisory Council, a wise group of sage advisors that we asked for their counsel, and they said, hey, you ought to open up a notice of inquiry. I agree with what Commissioner O'Reilly just said. I don't know whether it's 5G or millimeter wave or whatever, and frankly, who cares what it's called? Because the important thing here is that we make sure we harness it. Then we can name it. So this is all about new user experiments. This is all about new deployment models. This is all about new industries that can develop as a result. And today we're stepping in front of the power curve, so I'm happy to join with all of my colleagues, and let's make it officially unanimous right now. All in favor, say aye. Aye. Opposed? The ayes have it. Editorial privileges are granted to everyone from the Wireless Bureau and OET. Thank you for all of your efforts to lead us forward on this. Madam Secretary.
Mr. Chairman and Commissioners, the next item will be presented by the Wireline Competition Bureau. It is entitled Rates for Interstate Inmate Calling Services.
Here they come. Calpac, you got to figure out which group you're working with these days. Julie, you going to lead us?
I am. Good morning, Mr. Chairman and Commissioners. We're pleased to present this morning for your consideration a second further notice of proposed rulemaking that seeks comment on a comprehensive approach to reforming inmate calling services to ensure just, reasonable, and fair rates. The item seeks comment on a series of issues with the end goal of moving ICS towards market-driven rates, with providers competing to provide the best service at the lowest rates. This is assuredly not the state of affairs today. The item seeks comment on a balanced approach to lower ICS rates, but doing so in a way that provides appropriate cost recovery opportunities and transition periods for providers and facilities affected by the reform. Seated with me at the table are Kalpak Goudet, former chief of the Pricing Policy Division and current associate chief of the Media Bureau, and our thanks to the Media Bureau for allowing us to continue to use his services to bring this to fruition.
You need to make sure that you save that placard in front of you that has both titles on it.
That's a good one. And David Zessiger, acting deputy chief in the Pricing Division. I'd also like to acknowledge the rest of the team whose dedication produced the item we offer you today. Len Engeldow, Doug Galby, Greg Halajian, Rhonda Lien, and Don Sussman. I'd also like to thank OGC, the Consumer and Governmental Affairs Bureau, and the Enforcement Bureau for their contributions. And David will present the item.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman and Commissioners. Today the Bureau presents for your consideration a second further notice of proposed rulemaking on issues relating to inmate calling services. As the Commission works to fulfill its statutory mandate of ensuring that ICS rates are just, reasonable, and fairly compensatory, this second further notice seeks comment on a number of issues related to ongoing reform. The item seeks comment on building on the steps taken in the ICS report and order adopted last year that imposed interim interstate ICS rate caps and otherwise began the important work of reforming the ICS market and protecting consumers. First, the second further notice seeks comment on a comprehensive, market-based approach to achieving just and reasonable rates and fair compensation for all inmate calling, local, in-state long distance, and out-of-state long distance. The item finds that site commissions, payments by ICS providers to correctional institutions, have been principally responsible for undermining effective competition in the ICS market. The item seeks comment on prohibiting site commissions to eliminate their distorting influence on the ICS marketplace. The item also seeks comment on preserving jails and prisons' ability to recover the legitimate costs they incur in providing inmate calling services. It also seeks comment on allowing providers and facilities a reasonable period of time to transition to the new market-based regime. Second, the item seeks comment on adopting permanent rate caps for interstate and intrastate ICS calling as a backstop to the market-based approach to protect consumers from any risk of excessive ICS rates during the transition to the market-based solution. The item seeks comment on substantial cost data submitted by ICS providers in response to the Commission's data request and on a variety of rate proposals introduced in the record. The item also seeks comment on eliminating per-call connection fees, which can pose a financial hardship, especially when calls are inadvertently terminated. Third, the item seeks comment on prohibiting or capping so-called ancillary fees, charges in addition to high ICS rates that impose significant financial burdens on consumers. And finally, the item seeks comment on ways for the Commission to work cooperatively with states that undertake ICS reform, and on how to ensure just, reasonable, and fair rates in all states, on ensuring that inmate calling services are accessible for all Americans, including inmates and members of their families with disabilities, on implementing strong enforcement provisions and periodic reviews to ensure that the Commission's market-based reform is implemented successfully, and on the use of new communications technologies in correctional facilities. The Bureau recommends adoption of this item and requests editorial privileges. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David. Commissioner Clyburn.
If there ever were a time to stand up for fundamental fairness, this is it. As one of America's most beloved heroes famously observed, the moral test of government is how it treats those who are in the dawn of life, the children, those who are in the twilight of life, the elderly, and those who are in the shadows of life, the sick, the needy, and the handicapped. That great man was Vice President Hubert H. Humphrey, a leader who put humanity before politics. And as I think about the action we took last year and the steps we're taking this morning, I believe he would have been proud of this agency. For nearly a decade, the earnest efforts of beleaguered lawyers and loved ones of Americans' inmates fell short in the pursuit of equity and due process. Their quest for something as basic as making a phone call to family and friends at a reasonable and affordable price was set aside as the FCC pursued some more lofty goals. But for the persistent pleas of an unlikely heroine, Mrs. Martha Wright, a grandmother from Washington, D.C., who wanted nothing more than to stay in touch with her grandson, thousands of mothers, fathers, families, and inmates would not have more of an opportunity to do so, to do what the rest of us take for granted each and every day. That is to stay in touch with the people we care about the most. When the FCC took its first steps to provide relief to the families of inmates, we struck a chord for the public interest. We brought scores of families closer to parity with other Americans who are able to call anywhere in our country without making critical economic trade-offs. With the support of my colleague, Commissioner Rosenworcel, the impact of the first phase of reform of our nation's inmate calling regime has been tremendous. Our decision shows that doing the right thing can have reverberating effects. Since February, when the interstate rate caps of 21 cents for debit prepaid calls and 21 cents per minute for collect calls went into effect, call volumes across state lines have increased nearly 70% in some facilities and over 300% at one Department of Corrections locations. These are not just empty statistics. More affordable rates can help bring about increased and regular contact between inmates and their families. Studies show that having meaningful communications beyond prison walls can make a real difference when it comes to maintaining community ties, promoting rehabilitation, and reducing recidivism. And recent data underscore the critical need to reduce the recidivism rates in our nation. In April of 2014, the Department of Justice released a report analyzing the 5-year recidivism rates for over 400,000 prisoners in 30 states, and the results were troubling. 2/3 were rearrested within 3 years, and 3/4 were rearrested within 5 years. These trends come with enormous societal costs. In addition to more crime, crowded correctional facilities, more expensive prisons, and the judicial time required to prosecute these offenses, it costs an average of $31,000 per year to house each inmate. But what those stats do not show is the personal impact. 2.7 million children who have committed no crime are being punished by an unjust and unreasonable inmate calling structure. In addition to the anxiety associated with a parent who is absent on a daily basis, these young people suffer severe economic and personal hardships and are more likely to do poorly in school. All of this exacerbated by an unreasonable rate regime. While an affordable calling structure will not solve every problem highlighted, reforming the inmate calling regime can help make a difference for struggling families wishing to maintain contact. As a public servant, I strongly believe that those who have the power and the ability to promote the public interest should not make excuses or hesitate to do so. While the results from last year's order are significant, we have a lot more work left to do. The majority of calls from facilities are to friends, families, and legal representatives within the same state, and our order did not address these intra-state calls. While I sincerely hoped that the states which have yet to reform their intrastate inmate calling structures would have followed the FCC's lead, only a few have elected to do so. And what has been the result of that inaction? Since our order was released, we have witnessed disturbing trends. New and increased ancillary charges have appeared. Intrastate rates have inched higher than the already outrageous costs, and payments from the providers to those facilities known as site commissions have skyrocketed to as high as 96% of gross revenues. While I made it clear early on that I prefer to refrain from regulation, in this instance, the record shows that a comprehensive approach which addresses all rates and fees to enable this market to function properly is warranted. In my 16 years as a regulator, this is the clearest, most egregious case of market failure I have ever seen. Instead of getting better, rates and fees for consumers are more onerous. It is imperative for us to move quickly in order to adopt an order for total reform. While we sought comment on permanent interstates and intrastates reform last year, intervening developments necessitate launching a second further order of proposed rulemaking to ensure that we're on solid ground to reform to address all aspects of inmate calling services. The Commission has concluded tentatively that Congress gave it express authority in Section 276 to establish a per-call compensation plan for each and every intrastate and interstate call, and it also directs the Commission that the Commission shall preempt any inconsistent state regulations. Congress's directive could not have been more clear here, and it is past time for the FCC to act consistent with the statute and bring certainty and sanity to the industry and to consumers. Launching this second further notice also gives us the unique opportunity to evaluate the impact of our reforms, to evaluate the impact they have had on inmates, consumers, providers, and correctional facilities, and ask how best to structure comprehensive reforms for interstate and intrastate rates. There have also been intervening developments that would benefit from comments from the public, including the submission of data from inmate calling providers in August of this year, as required by last year's orders proposals, for comprehensive reform filed by several ICS providers, and the action taken by the Alabama Public Service Commission, which included adoption of caps on ancillary charges. While I continue to support the cost-based approach in the order, moving forward with comprehensive reform allows us to seek comment on a simpler framework with the goal of allowing market forces to put pressure on rates rather than the Commission setting up a more regulatory, separate rate tier per facility. Such framework was not possible with the incremental interstate-only approach. To the contrary, as we have seen, intrastate rates and fees can circumvent these very benefits that the interstate-only reforms have realized. The disturbing trends of higher site commissions, coupled with new and increasing ancillary charges, underscore the fact that we need a comprehensive approach that addresses all rates and fees for this market to function properly. This second further notice represents what I believe is a balanced approach that includes rates that are higher than I would have proposed and transitions that are longer than I would have preferred. But it addresses concerns raised in the record and strikes a reasonable path forward that is administratively simple and less burdensome for consumers, providers, facilities, and this commission. I want to thank my colleagues for the collaboration on this item. I am extremely thankful to the chairman for continuing to make this issue a priority for this agency. And I will be forever grateful for the continued assistance from my friend and colleague, Commissioner Jessica Rosenworcel, whose support today and vote last year have enabled this nation to realize some tremendous benefits, the results that we speak of today. And I appreciate the constructive input of Commissioner O'Reilly, including his suggestion to seek comment on other ways to promote competition in the industry without regulation. For as long as I can remember, the benefits and trade-offs from compromises have netted some impressive policy results. We should not, however, compromise on the means we possess to grant relief to the most vulnerable in our society. All told, we offered edits to nearly 45% of the paragraphs in this item in the spirit of compromise. But what I could not agree to see comment on is a reading of the statute that suggested Congress intended Section 276 to require the payment of site commissions, nor could I agree to questions that undercut last year's order or previous decisions made by this agency. Today, I can say with comfort and good conscience that I cast my vote knowing that I did everything possible to reach a good faith consensus, and I am pleased to offer my full support of this second further notice. As Hubert Humphrey said, you can always debate about what you should have done. The question is, what are you going to do? While today's vote cannot make up for the inactions of the past, it is my hope that an expeditious move to a final order will bring relief to the 2.7 million children and their families who just want to hear a parent's voice, who just want to share what they experience each day. And I want to show all of them that the process can work for them too. Mr. Chairman, as I yield, allow me to thank the small but dedicated team of the Wireline Competition Bureau led by Julie Beach, including Calpac Goudet. You bring me to tears, Calpac. Lynn Engundau, David Zessinger, Rhonda Lynn, Don Sussman, Don Galby, as well as the support from your office with Patrick Haley, and from the Commissioner's office, Rosenworcel's office, Valerie Galliso, and my clerk, Christine Sandquist. And I could not yield today without thanking so much the hard work of Rebecca Goodhart, who spent nights and weekends working on this item to achieve a result that I think is in the public interest. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Commissioner Clyburn, thank you. You know, there are so many issues that we deal with that we get emotional about, but there are so few issues that have real personal emotion and individual impact associated with them. I think that Commissioner Rosenworcel would join me in observing that you use the term persistent heroine to describe Ms. Wright. I think we're talking about two persistent heroines here. So thank you, Commissioner Clyburn. Commissioner Rosenworcel.
It's intimidating to follow such powerful words. I know, she's a force of nature. All right. With this rulemaking, we take a critical step toward addressing the high cost that prison inmates and their families pay for phone service. this is not just an issue of markets and rates. This is a broader issue of social justice. In many cases, inmates are separated from their families by hundreds of miles, and families may lack the time and means to make regular visits. Phone calls are the only way these families can stay connected. But when a single call may cost as much as what you and I pay for unlimited phone service, the financial burden of staying in touch may be too great for inmates' families to bear. This harms the families and children of the incarcerated. But it goes beyond that. It harms all of us, because we know that regular contact between prisoners and family members reduces recidivism. And in a country with the highest per capita incarceration rate in the world, where we spend nearly $58 billion annually to manage our prison population, all of us should care about reducing recidivism. Last year, the Commission took its first big step to address this problem. As a result, we reduced interstate long-distance inmate calling rates by nearly 40%. But we vowed to do more, and that is why we're here today. This new rulemaking seeks to address the exorbitant rates that prisoners and families of prisoners still face for in-state calls and a slew of suspect fees for ancillary services and commission charges. So, I am pleased to support today's rulemaking. I believe that when history is written, we will be able to say that we did good and we cleaned up these questionable charges and usurious rates. Moreover, I believe that when history is written, it will show that there are two women who deserve credit for righting this wrong. The first is Martha Wright, who more than a decade ago petitioned this agency because she thought it was flat out unacceptable that she had to pay outlandish fees just to stay in touch with her grandson. The second is my colleague, Commissioner Mignon Clyburn, who has been a tireless, devoted advocate for fixing this problem. Now, our arc for action may be far too long, but I'm confident it will bend toward justice. These two women are chiefly responsible, and I'm proud to support them.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Pai.
2 years ago, when we opened this docket with a unanimous notice of proposed rulemaking, I welcomed the opportunity to address the petition filed by Martha Wright almost a decade before, when she came to the FCC seeking redress for the high rates she paid to speak with her then incarcerated grandson. As I said then, she should not have had to wait for years for her call to be answered. And I added, I am open to exploring whether there is action we can and should take, consistent with our legal authority, to address the issues identified in Martha Wright's petition for rulemaking. That sentiment remains true today. But I cannot support rules that lack a solid legal foundation. While I do not doubt that last year's order was motivated by the best of intentions, I could not countenance its legal flaws, and neither could the D.C. Circuit, which ultimately unanimously stayed most of the adopted rules, a stay that remains in effect today and does no good for consumers or the Commission. When this second further notice first circulated, I feared that the Commission was headed down that path again. The proposal seemed to assume that the Communications Act sets no limits on our authority. The data analysis was one-sided, and the alternatives to highly intrusive regulation were few. That's why I was pleased when I reached an agreement with my colleagues that we would work together to modify this second further notice so that it would be like the initiating notice. All commissioners would be able to ask any questions, assess the data, and seek comment on alternatives. As a firm believer in the marketplace of ideas, I welcomed this inclusive process because it offered the hope that the Commission would explore all issues fully and fairly, ensuring that we would have a solid record on both the law and the facts before making a decision ultimately that would stand up in court. But when I offered my suggestions, some topics suddenly became off limits, and the deal was abruptly taken off the table. I was told that additional questions concerning our legal authority would not be asked. I was informed that data showing that the costs of providing service at the smallest jails exceed the costs at prisons on average by 14.5 cents would not be included. I was shocked and I was disappointed at this decision, a decision which unnecessarily and unwisely rejects an open-minded, consensus-based approach to examining this issue, and one which I cannot support. I fear this decision bodes poorly for this proceeding. For if we can't agree to gather all the evidence, and if we refuse to consider the limits of our authority, how can we possibly agree on a just solution that comports with the law? Nevertheless, I appreciate that my colleagues amended the second further notice to include some alternatives to the preferred course of action, and I accordingly will be voting to concur in part. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Commissioner O'Reilly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. There is no dispute that the prison payphone market as a whole does not seem to be functioning properly. I concur with the initiation of this notice to review and consider comments to address the problem. Where I may differ from some of my colleagues is on how best to tackle it. I would prefer to permit real competition within the facilities because over time, competition has proven to be the best way to protect and benefit consumers, lower costs, and encourage innovation. Therefore, I'm glad the notice now includes a section on ways to reduce barriers to entry and competition. Working with Commissioner Clyburn and her staff, as well as the Chairman's office and Bureau staff, questions about ways to remove barriers to competition were added, and the item was edited to strike a more neutral tone throughout. This process generally worked for me, and it's what enabled me to concur in part. I also appreciate the comments and views of my colleague from Kansas, Commissioner Pai. The reasons I dissent in part, however, is that absence a compelling and actionable record on competition, the notice leads us down a highly regulatory path that I would not have imagined possible based on the statute alone. Section 276 was intended to protect payphone providers that had been unable to receive fair compensation for their service, not to dictate, for example, whether they charge per minute or per call, or how they recover legitimate fees. Moreover, while we all must review the record in response to the notice, I am concerned that this extensive item and the Commission's previous work in this area have set the stage for an extreme rate regulation once more that I'm unlikely to favor. I thank again the willingness of my colleagues, especially Commissioner Clyburn, for working with me on this item. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Commissioner. Our congressional mandate is clear: to protect consumers. That means all consumers. That means consumers and their families. And that means regardless of where they domicile. That's the step that we're taking today. So with that, I will call for the vote. All in favor, say aye. Aye. Opposed?
Concurring part, dissenting part.
The ayes have it. The request for editorial privileges is granted. Thank you very much, Julie Kalpak. You can now go back to your other job. David, thanks for all your efforts. Madam Secretary.
Mr. Chairman and Commissioners, last on your agenda, the Public Safety and Homeland Security Bureau will give a presentation regarding an inquiry into a major 911 service outage that affected 7 states in April 2014.
Thank you very much. Admiral, over to you, sir. Chairman Danner, welcome. We want to, in particular, call out and recognize your being with us today. We appreciate all the help that you have been on this item. We're honored to have you with us today.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, Chairman Wheeler and Commissioners. Today we will provide you with an overview of the Bureau's response to the massive multi-state 911 outage that happened on April 9th and 10th of this year. The outage affected areas within the Pacific Northwest, including the entire state of Washington, the Southeast, Pennsylvania, and the St. Paul, Minneapolis metro region. In all, portions of 7 states lost 911 service due to a software failure that occurred not in those states, but halfway across the country in Colorado. With me today from the Public Safety and Homeland Security Bureau are Jeff Goldthorpe, Associate Bureau Chief, and head of the Cybersecurity and Communications Reliability Division, and Michael Connolly, an attorney from our Bureau who will present the report. Joining us at the table is Commissioner David Danner, the chairman of the Washington State Utilities and Transportation Commission. I would also like to recognize Thera Bradshaw, Executive Director of the Hawaii 911 Board, who is in the audience and provided us with useful context about outage trends in her state, which have helped frame the issues illuminated in this inquiry. Just before midnight on April 9th, a preventable software error happened on a critical 911 service component in Englewood, Colorado. The piece of equipment is part of a complex 911 network architecture that processes emergency calls from all over the United States. At its most basic level, 911 calls from the various jurisdictions across the nation are sent to Englewood for the processing necessary to route and complete the calls at local 911 call centers. Because of this software error, however, the signals in this case were not relayed back to the appropriate 911 call centers. In a very real sense, 911 calls got stuck in Colorado. And the chairman knows I'm a propulsion engineer from my earliest days. The Gazindas had no gozoutas. This 911 outage...
On those technical terms, you know.
Yes, sir. This 911 outage lasted over 6 hours, potentially jeopardizing over 11 million Americans in 7 states, from the Pacific coast to the Atlantic. Over 6,600 calls for help went unanswered. While we are heartened that there appear to have been no fatalities stemming from this outage, we are also troubled that this outage represents an increasing trend of sunny day outages impacting entire states or multiple states and caused by avoidable system failures. Michael will talk about the specifics of this outage, and I will talk about the big picture reliability issues that are at the heart of the transition to an IP-based telephony world and what that means for 911 reliability. First, there is a long-standing market reality that leads to challenges in 911 reliability. There is a relatively small, some would say niche market for 911 service. It appears that traditional market drivers have not led to the same kind of robustness for 911 services that is enjoyed by more widely used commercial internet-based services. Second, mechanisms for holding parties accountable for 911 reliability have become diluted in today's technological setting, with numerous providers supporting critical call-to-completion functions crossing several oversight and jurisdictional boundaries. Third, single-component failures in a poorly implemented tech transition 911 world impact not just one community, but can impact neighboring communities as well. This means that mutual assistance from 911 call centers in the next county over may not be available. Technical vulnerabilities and reliability problems that were once just local problems now impact entire states, or in this case, multiple states. The Commission has been deeply involved in and taken steps to promote communications reliability for decades. In doing so, we have analyzed large outages stemming from technical transitions, like electronic switches several decades ago, new protocols like SS7 in the 90s, restructuring of the market from divestiture, and most recently, the introduction of VoIP. As those new technologies have been introduced, however, we have seen impacts that have outages that affect larger and larger numbers of consumers from a single outage. This Bureau has had a continuing role in tracking and assessing communication reliability for years. And through the Network Outage Reporting System, or NORS, we've been able to see reliability trends over the past decade. While the reliability of communications in general has great importance for many critical functions in our society, the reliability of 911 communications is a unique imperative that must be proactively protected. Calls for help must go through, period. The statute establishing 911 service is clear, and more importantly, all the stakeholders involved must understand the life or death consequences for falling short. In the past, under legacy network architectures and switch-based telephony, we've seen variations in achieved 911 reliability due to equipment failures and new systems. And we've certainly seen it affected by storms and other catastrophic events. One such event came during 2012, a derecho here in the Mid-Atlantic region, where over a dozen 911 call centers in the region were not able to receive 911 calls for several days. In the inquiry conducted after that outage, it became apparent that the physical infrastructure supporting 911 services was highly vulnerable to wide area weather impacts where reliability and resiliency best practices were not adhered to. This led the Commission to address the systematic vulnerability by directing annual reviews for circuit diversity, backup power, and network monitoring. In the April 2014 multi-state outage, however, there was not a weather, earthquake, fire, or other calamity-induced triggering event. There was a failure of a single system that unfortunately had derecho-like consequences. Neither additional diverse routes, more backup power, or better remote monitoring would have prevented this outage. This outage, and the trend we're beginning to see, cannot simply be dismissed as inevitable failures in a complex system. While network failures, component failures, are inevitable, the design of the service architecture needs to account for this and support continued service despite individual component failures. And where that falls short, the system of systems must degrade gracefully, minimizing impacts to communities and consumers. In other words, some failures will inevitably occur, but networks should be designed to minimize and mitigate their impact, not having an increasing trend of larger and larger groups of consumers impacted by simple equipment failures. The ability to send data inexpensively over large distances has allowed providers to support key functions for 911 call processing now in just one or two systems that serve the entire nation. A failure of such systems affects more people than ever, in this case millions of people per outage. They cross beyond traditional boundaries into multiple jurisdictions. These massive outages are not confined to a particular locale. Based on our review of the spike in large-scale outages, we believe that factors related to tech transition have played a role. New technology can and has introduced wonderful new functionalities. And this is true for 911 as well. But it can just as easily be used to lower operating costs through consolidation of hardware and software. Both are worthy goals, but both must be kept in balance. What distinguishes these new kinds of outages from those in the past is that they appear to be caused by purely technical failures, sunny day failures, where the only reason the system didn't work was that it was as it was supposed to, is because of some internal breakdown, and that the scope included entire or multiple states. Just this year alone, we have already experienced multiple such sunny day outages. In addition to the April multi-state 911 outage that Michael will detail, we note extensive statewide outages in Hawaii early this year and in Vermont in August that caused numerous calls to 911 to go unanswered. Most recently, a publicly reported outage for a major wireless carrier prevented over 6,000 911 call centers from receiving any calls from from consumers using that carrier for 2 hours. To put this in perspective, there was no such sunny day multi-jurisdiction outage in 2013 or in any of the preceding years for which we have recorded outage data. This is a new trend, a spike in the data. These very large complete 911 outages represent an alarming trend, the spike I referred to. To be complete, in the past 10 years, there have been over 20 nationwide or regional partial outage where there have been a loss of location information on 911 calls due to concentration of location databases. But in each of these cases, the call still went through, albeit in a location-degraded manner. This specific outage has real personal impact. As we read the next day in the Washington State papers, one Washingtonian early that morning encountered an intruder in her home. 37 times she called for 911. 37 times she received no answer. You may have heard of the golden hour concept in medicine, and I'm not a doctor and I can't speak to the full analysis behind it, but the general principle is well established and applicable here. Your chance of surviving many medical emergencies depends on how quickly you get medical treatment, and calls to 911 are often the link to getting that medical help. In my experience, deployed overseas, in Iraq, our military forces have used the golden hour as an organizing principle for distribution of first responders, communications, transport, and medical facilities. The same is true for communities around our country. Simply put, the call for help pegs the golden hour. If your call for help is delayed to the point where responders can't get the patient to trauma care in an hour, your prior planning is for naught. Each of these outages exceeded the golden hour standard. This is a call to action, and together we must change the trajectory for 911 readiness. This report represents hard work and long hours by Bureau staff, and we appreciate the supporting efforts of many people throughout the Commission and the states that were impacted. I would particularly like to thank the Office of General Counsel, in particular Linda Oliver and Brill Richardson, for help with this report. And I'd now like to introduce Chairman David Danner of the Washington State Utilities and Transportation Commission.
Welcome, Mr. Chairman.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you, Admiral Simpson. As he said, I'm Dave Danner. I'm chair of the Washington Utilities and Transportation Commission, and I very much appreciate the opportunity to be here in front of you today. So as you've heard, the 911 outage on April 9th and 10th affected several states, but it was centered in my state of Washington, where some 4,500 911 calls did not go through during an 8-hour period. While these numbers themselves are alarming, one really begins to realize the impact of an outage like this when you hear of the stories of individuals and individual families who are without 911 services during times of crisis. Imagine the story, you heard the story about the intruder. Imagine the story of a woman in Lakewood, Washington. At 1 o'clock in the morning on April 10th, her mother, who had had kidney stone surgery the day before, awoke in extreme pain and began fainting several times. You can imagine this woman's state of mind as she made call after call, first on her landline, later on her cell, but she only got busy signals. She finally called the local hospital, and after some confusion and discussion, they patched her through to the South Puget Sound Dispatch, which sent an ambulance. Her mother was hospitalized that night with internal bleeding. That's just one story. But I think it illustrates the degree to which our citizens rely on 911 services. It is literally a lifeline. It's imperative that we minimize both the frequency and duration of 911 outages, that we ensure that we have sufficient redundancy built into these systems, that we maintain accurate ALI databases, and that we ensure that companies provide timely communication both with state agencies and the public when 911 services go down. The UTC staff began an investigation of the April 9/11 outage the day after the event. That investigation is still ongoing, so at this point our staff has made no findings, and I can't comment on any potential enforcement actions that we might take. But I can say that this outage and others shine a light on the need to continually assess and reassess the architecture of next-generation 911 systems, which are increasingly interstate in nature, and we must identify and address any gaps in regulation of 911 that may result from the transition to an IP-based system. And I think the best way to do that is to establish an ongoing dialogue and collaboration between the FCC and states. We are aware of outage investigations that are ongoing right now in several states, including Vermont, Colorado, Iowa, and California. It makes sense for us to share information where we can to identify problems that are common among the states and develop strategies to address them. And I think we're headed in the right direction. I commend Admiral Simpson for his outreach to state regulators, including his visit to Dallas last summer to meet with our national association, NARUC. The states are now turning considerable attention to this matter, and Admiral Simpson has been a tremendous resource, and we really appreciate it. I also want to commend the staff of the Public Safety and Homeland Security Bureau for their work working with our staff at the UTC and Olympia as we both conduct parallel investigations of the April outage. This kind of cooperation is essential as we work to ensure the resiliency of the 911 services. So, Mr. Chairman and Commissioners, thank you again for the opportunity to be here. I very much appreciate the attention that the FCC and that you are giving to this very important matter. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
And Michael Conley will present the report.
Michael.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman and Commissioners, and welcome, Chairman Danner. Today, the Bureau presents its report on the April 911 outage that affected 11 million people, for over 6 hours in 7 geographically distant states, resulting in over 6,600 failed calls to 911. The inquiry that led up to this report found that the April 2004 multi-state outage was caused by a single preventable software coding error in a third-party vendor's Emergency Call Management Center, or ECMC, in Englewood, Colorado, that went unnoticed for about an hour until the early hours of the morning on April 10th. Specifically, the coding error occurred in the critical call routing hub owned and operated by the vendor, which is a provider of 911 emergency communication infrastructure, systems and services to telecommunications service providers and public safety agencies throughout the United States. The software at issue received location information from the originating provider and compares that to lookup tables with communication trunks for 911 call centers. A module in the software keeps track of the trunk assignment for 911 calls going out to several dozen 911 call centers, known as Public Safety Answering Points, or PSAPs, around the nation that use a legacy trunking format known as Centralized Automatic Messaging Accounting, or CAMA. In general terms, the software module at the Englewood ECMC was programmed with an arbitrary limit for the counter as each 911 call assignment was made. Once the ECMC reached its last finite number, here, 40 million, 911 calls still continued to be processed into Englewood, but once the software stopped making trunk assignments, having reached that arbitrary counter limit, further processing stopped, and no calls were being sent back out to the appropriate PSAPs. Thousands of people throughout the country were left stranded when their 911 calls went undelivered. Importantly, there were alarm indications that could have warned the staff of the impending failure, but inadequate alarm management resulted in significant delays in determining the coding error and restoring 911 service to full functionality. In this case, the relevant alarms received the same prioritization as routine supervisory alarms and thus were subsequently lost in the noise. Personnel at the Englewood ECMC appear to have neither realized what had failed nor how serious the problem was. The vendor operates a redundant hub in Miami, Florida, to which 911 traffic could have been immediately rerouted. But because the malfunction was not detected right away, and because mitigation actions were not efficiently developed, the vendor did not switch over traffic, either automatically or manually, to Miami until 6 hours after the outage began. Our interviews suggest that confusion between providers over a non-related outage also contributed to the delay. A lack of common situational awareness between providers, call centers, and consumers prevented efficient, timely mitigation. Once traffic was switched over to Miami over 6 hours later, service was restored right away. The coding error at the vendor's Englewood ECMC affected 81 PSAPs in 7 states. It's important to recognize that in all of the areas served by each of the 81 PSAPs, calls to 911 would, at some point in their call completion path, in their journey from the 911 caller to the PSAP that could have helped, that could have provided help, that call would have been directed to and traversed the Englewood ECMC. But because of the way this single piece of equipment was set up and programmed, thousands of calls to 911 simply got stuck in Englewood. This outage was enormously wide, and by wide I mean it spanned a lot of geography, affected millions of people, and it lasted a long time. It is significant, and we should consider that, in this case, modern network architecture enabled consolidation of critical 911 functions in just 2 locations, Englewood and Miami, serving multiple states. But while this consolidation ostensibly lowered operating costs and improved operations through dedicated workforce with a high degree of competence,
The outage demonstrates that consolidation may result in too much dependence placed upon a few critical elements, or single points, you might call them. This means providers must responsibly evaluate end-to-end availability, identify interdependencies, and design networks with resiliency and robustness to achieve low to no fail end-to-end results. And as Chairman Danner pointed out, of all the places involved in this outage, the impacts were most extensive in the state of Washington, where all of that state's PSAPs were affected to some degree. Thus, all of the residents in that state, nearly 7 million, had their ability to have their 911 calls adversely affected that night and early morning. None of the carefully arranged PSAPs backing up neighboring PSAPs in their contingency plans compensated for this outage, because those backup PSAPs themselves were affected as part of the same network. Close to 3 million people in Minnesota, over half that state's population, mostly centered in the St. Paul, Minneapolis metro region, also had their ability to reach 911 impacted by this outage, along with hundreds of thousands in the other 5 states. In light of the Bureau's findings, this report notes and recommends the following. First, the transition to NG 911 introduces new technologies, service arrangements, and business relationships into the 911 ecosystem, which adds complexity and heightens the risk of a widespread outage with the potential to affect multiple states. The Bureau recommends that the Commission charge the Communications Security, Reliability, and Interoperability Council, or CSRIC, with developing and refining a comprehensive set of best practices in this area. Second, the Commission should conduct further proceedings as needed to ensure that reliability of 911 service in the United States continues to promote the safety of life and property by maintaining pace with evolving technologies and challenges, and that both incumbent 911 service providers and new entrants remain fully accountable to the public they serve. Third, the transition to NG 911 creates a need for closer coordination of evolving practices and expectations regarding 911 among all governmental and commercial entities, as well as a broad-based understanding among all stakeholders regarding the status of deployment of NG 911 from all stakeholders involved. Fourth, all parties involved in 911 end-to-end call completion, as well as appropriate public safety authorities, need to take steps to improve situational awareness during an outage. Fifth, the Commission should use enforcement action as necessary to safeguard reliable end-to-end 911 service. 911 service providers have to remain vigilant and ensure compliance with the Commission's 911 requirements, including rules on outage reporting, particularly as they transition to NG 911 networks. And finally, primary 911 service providers should monitor their contractual relationships to establish clear operational roles and responsibilities for situational awareness and information sharing, and exercise operational oversight with respect to their subcontractors and implement the appropriate mechanisms to retain meaningful control. As the United States transitions to new methods of communication, the Bureau urges that we need to take care to ensure that our inherent trust in the 911 system does not get lost in that transition. Thank you for this opportunity to present the Bureau's report.
Thank you very much to all of you. I'm sure that many comments up here. Commissioner Clyburn.
Thank you. There are a number of points in this report that I find alarming, including the fact that 11 million people, including those in my home state of South Carolina, were without 911 service for up to 6 hours. But what I find most disturbing is that despite the number of reports, notices of proposed rulemakings, and orders about the importance of reliable 911 services, which this Commission has released during my tenure, this particular outage could have been prevented by better implementation of basic network management functions. The clear takeaway from this report: no matter how advanced our communications systems become, technologies can never replace accountability, redundancy, and coordination with stakeholders. These principles should be fundamental for any entity providing emergency communication services on behalf of a state or local government. This is a wake-up call for all relevant stakeholders, and I hope it will spur communications companies to engage in a race to the top in order to provide the most reliable emergency services possible. State and local governments, especially those who contract with private companies to provide these services, should demand high-quality service, and I know that this agency will continue monitoring companies and initiate, if necessary, a proceeding designed to ensure all 911 providers offer reliable service to the American public. I wish to thank the Public Safety and Homeland Security Bureau for this morning's presentation. Thank you, Admiral Simpson, and thank you, Michael Connolly. I also wish to thank my colleague, Chairman David Danner from the Washington Utilities Transportation Commission for providing real-world examples and your insights as to why this is important. And I know you are staffed today by the most able General Counsel, Brad Ramsey. I'm up on the, I'm up here today, so I have to say that in that order. But you know the real Brad Ramsey. But I wish to thank you again for your support and for reemphasizing the seriousness and necessity of this item today. Thank you.
Commissioner Rose-Worcel.
First telephone number that I taught my children was 911. It's a number that every one of us knows by heart, but every one of us hopes to never have to use. On April 9th, 2014, thousands of people had to call 911. But instead of reaching help at the end of the line, they got silenced. 81 911 call centers spanning 7 states lost service for as long as 6 hours. The source of this multi-state 911 outage? Not a natural disaster, not a power failure. It was a software glitch. A software glitch that put the lives and safety of 11 million Americans at risk. So I visited Washington State shortly after this outage. Now, in Washington, as you know all too well, all 39 of the state's 911 call centers went dark just weeks after the Oso mudslide swiftly and tragically claimed a rural community and the lives of 43 people. With this tragedy fresh in mind, people in Washington asked me repeatedly, what were we doing about 911 service failures? These failures are preventable. That's what we know now, because the Commission staff has done extraordinary work to understand just what happened. They worked with carriers, reached out to public safety and state officials, and combed through reams and reams of data. As a result, we know that this multi-state outage was caused by a coding error. We know that this error stopped calls from being routed through the network to affected 911 call centers. And we know that because of a totally inadequate alarm system, this error was not detected for as much as 6 hours, causing more than 6,600 911 calls to go unanswered. So, now that we know what went wrong, we need to do something about it. What is apparent to me is that as we transition our emergency service systems to next generation 911, essential elements of our traditional 911 network topology are changing. While a more centralized IP-based system can mean tremendous new functionality, it also can mean new vulnerabilities. The kind of software glitch we had here is just an early demonstration case. before a worse one results, or a malicious one as part of a cyber attack, we need to get our house in order. We need to fix this for the people of Washington State and the 6 other states that suffered from this software glitch. We need to fix this for my children and every one of us who have taught and been taught that 911 is the one number you need in an emergency. So I look forward to working with my colleagues here and in the states to follow up on this presentation and report and help fix this problem.
Yea and verily. Commissioner Pai.
When Americans dial 911, they expect and deserve to reach emergency personnel who can assist them in their time of need. And that's why the type of failure detailed in the Public Safety and Homeland Security Bureau's report is absolutely unacceptable. We can't have over 11 million people lose access to 911 for any length of time, let alone for up to 6 hours. We just can't. Based on this report's findings, the failure that occurred here was entirely preventable. Indeed, even after it occurred, its impact could have been significantly mitigated had the decision been made earlier to route calls through an alternative available facility. I'm glad the Bureau thoroughly investigated this failure and identified its root cause. I'm also glad that steps have already been taken to reduce the chance of history repeating itself. Enhanced alarming and manual checks are now in place, along with additional training and other procedures that will allow for more effective monitoring and detection of potential problems in the 911 system. Inspections have also been done to determine if there are similar vulnerabilities in other parts of the relevant 911 architecture. Now, although the report finds that this failure did not result in any fatalities, it nonetheless should serve as a much-needed wake-up call, as the example that Chairman Danner gave about the woman whose mother was hospitalized illustrates. Because we might not be so lucky the next time around. 911 call centers must remain vigilant and hold their service providers accountable. And in turn, providers of 911 services have a special responsibility to ensure that they adopt and abide by best practices, including maintaining redundant and reliable networks. I agree that the FCC has an important role to play in facilitating the development of such best practices. And so I'm pleased that one of the Bureau's recommendations today is that the Commission charge the Communications Security, Reliability, and Interoperability Council, or CISRIC, with developing a comprehensive set of best practices in this area. For years, CISRIC has played a key role in helping the Commission carry out our charge to work cooperatively with public safety organizations and industry participants to develop best practices. I look forward to reviewing its suggestions on how best to ensure the reliability of 911 networks as we continue the beneficial transition to a fully IP-based NG 911 environment. I want to thank the staff of the Public Safety and Homeland Security Bureau, led by Admiral Simpson, in particular Michael Connolly for the informative presentation, and Chairman Danner for coming from Washington to Washington to share your perspectives on what is a critical issue, a matter literally of life and death. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner O'Reilly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. There's an awful lot in the report to digest and raises a number of issues, but I wanted to focus on one today, and that was the one my colleague just highlighted, the recommendation to CISRIC that it prepare, develop, and implement NG 911 transition best practices. And I was trying to figure out how this matched up with already what the charter of CISRIC is, and I'm having trouble figuring out why they weren't already able to do this. And then I had to dig back a little bit and see that they actually did do this in 2011. So then the question came to me, what has been done with that work from 2011? The group, Working Group 4B, called Transition to NG 911, and its 190-page report. Have carriers, everyone, maybe you can help me here, have carriers adopted these best practices? Have the best practices been dismissed? And then how does that match up with a recommendation to develop them if we already have them? Isn't it wouldn't it be better just to update them, or is there some kind of difference between the two that I'm missing?
Commissioner, it's a great question.
Thank you. I try.
Working Group 4 was useful in providing an operational construct for Next Generation 911. It does not appear to have anticipated the factors that have led to the reduction in end-to-end 911 reliability from the concentration of the capability in the small number of locations. to be fair, technology has also changed in that time frame, and I believe that if the engineers today that were a part of that working group were to look at options, they would never have recommended the concentration of capabilities in just 2 locations. You distribute it around the cloud. You would ensure that you have the ability to gracefully degrade. It's just the state of where we're at today with what's possible from technology. So it's really reflective, I think, of the responsibility that Chairman Danner talked about, which is as we proceed to Next Generation 911, you can't just snap a chalk line and say, we're done. We designed Next Generation 911, leave us alone. We're going to make sure it's good for what we planned for a couple of years ago. The reality is that technology changes around us, and that technology can contribute to an increased reliability, but it can also contribute to lowered operational costs. And if we don't keep our eye on the ball here and just let us drive down the path of lowest possible cost 911, we'll get the kinds of failures that we saw today. So I think it's incumbent on the CISRIC to not, as was said before earlier in this meeting, rest on their laurels, but the industry and together with the CISRIC needs to stay on this and regularly reevaluate what was designed, what was actually implemented, because quite often the CISRIC suggests something and then it doesn't happen, and modify that based on the real world today.
So this is the previous CISRIC, but this is part of the current charter of the current CISRIC. Were they not charged with looking at this particular transition? Because when I look at their charter, they are. Was there some kind of breakdown there that we should have been asking them to look at this issue closer?
I think we have asked this CISRIC to look at risk management, and Working Group 4 is a good example where we have looked proactively at the introduction of potential cyber threats to that concentration of equipment that we just described. And the CISRIC, the current CISRIC, is, I believe, doing a good job at evaluating the risk factors associated with critical communications and improving upon the accountability for delivering that service. So I think the current CISRIC is working on elements of this problem that you've got to be able to measure and then from those measurements hold accountable. And that's what this CISRIC is working on.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Commissioner O'Reilly. You know, this is a terrifying report of unacceptable circumstances. You know, we talk a lot about Washington, but there were multiple circumstances in this report. So this is not a one-off kind of situation. Clearly, promoting the protection of public safety is job one for this agency. Clearly, technology is changing the way in which 911 is provided. This is good. We're pro new technology, but we're even more pro public safety. The presentation makes it clear that the transition to all IP networks is going to create a series of challenges such as this. An outage as a result of a hurricane or flooding is one thing. An outage as a result of bad code is completely something else. I agree with Commissioner Pai's comment that there's a special responsibility that people who provide these services, and increasingly they're provided on an outsourced basis, have to make sure that they live up to the expectations that we all have for them. I, for one, was very disappointed to see some of the replies come in on this, in which some of the providers said, well, you know, stuff happens. That's not an acceptable answer. And I want to respond specifically to what Commissioner Rosenworcel said when she said that we have to do something about this. Yes, and we have to do something about this quickly. You have told us that this is a call to action. You have told us we must respond, and we are charging you, as you know, with a quick and effective response proposal to come back to this panel. So we appreciate you identifying the issues, and we're standing by. Thank you. Let me just reiterate. We're standing by for a quick response. Close that thought. Having finished the business part of today's session, is there anything that my colleagues would like to bring? Commissioner Clyburn, Rosenworcel, Pond? The magic words, then, ladies and gentlemen. That concludes the meeting. The next meeting will be, the next formal meeting will be on November the 21st, 2014. We stand adjourned until then. Thank you. Look at this killer's lineup here, you know, standing before the firing squad.
All right, everyone, we'll get started with the press conference. Chairman Wheeler has a few words to start us off, and then we'll go right to your questions.
You guys can start behaving over there.
All right.
I know that Brooks was the one who was over in the corner.
Causing trouble.
It gets quiet when Brooks leaves. Okay. Brian, are you coming around to the table? There? Okay. Okay. So today we did multiple things that all interrelate. We started a process to next generation wireless. We dealt with facilities sightings that are necessary both for today and for that new next generation wireless tomorrow. We moved on further reform in inmate calling, and we reviewed our key public safety responsibilities in an all IP world. Those are non-trivial activities. I look forward to talking with you about anything else that you would like to cover.
Let's start over here with Brandon this time.
Oh, look at Sir.
On the inmate calling services, could you discuss how the FCC wants to take a more market-based approach to controlling costs as opposed to putting a hard cap on prices or ancillary fees?
Well, again, remember what we're talking about is that this is a further notice in which we're going to ask questions exactly like that. Brian.
Hi, Mr. Chairman. Earlier this week, HBO and CBS announced that they were going to start up their streaming services. I'm just wondering, how you think that's going to affect the marketplace and what that'll mean for competition.
In case you haven't noticed, we are pro-innovation and pro-competition. Okay. To the effect that those kinds of developments happen, obviously they're going to have a marketplace impact. And as we've discussed here, I think in the last time that I was able to meet with you, we have been looking at the entire question of what is an MVPD, which will be a key component of that.
Brooks.
You've got 3 Native Americans joined on the petition to get you guys to look at the name of the Washington football team. Why not put it out for comment?
Well, it is a petition to review a license renewal application. We get hundreds of those every year. It's being handled just like all the others, and that is that there's an opportunity for the party to respond. There's an opportunity for a response to that, and then you go on and determine whether it's putting out further is needed. We're handling this by the established process.
Thank you. Can you give any insight into why the Commission removed the broadcaster interference item from today's agenda?
It was voted 5-0 yesterday.
Chairman, what's your time frame for action on Aereo's request to be an MVPD? and your plans for a broader rulemaking on over-the-top video?
Stay tuned. It's the right question. As I've told you before, as I just said to Brian, it's something that we're very involved in and looking at, and stay tuned.
Could I just ask if there would be action this year?
Is it bigger than a breadbasket? Is that what you're suggesting? Stay tuned. Brett.
Hi, Chairman. When you're reviewing a merger, does it matter to you how a company treats its customers? Is that part of the public interest analysis, customer service, or are you just looking at sort of antitrust analysis?
So it's interesting that we have a responsibility to look at the public interest, convenience, and necessity. And that the Congress has defined that broadly. I don't want to go into any details about what we're doing on any specific merger, but the public interest is a broad definition. Gotham.
Hello, Chairman.
You're on.
Okay. So a lot of talk about journalism these days and the decline of newspapers due to all sorts of reasons. It came up while I was discussing a story that the broadcasters carry local news, network news as part of a public interest obligation. The cable carriers have C-SPAN, which I believe you had some hand in helping to create. So the question is, should broadband or wireless carriers have any sort of public interest obligation to disseminate or provide news or original reporting to the public?
You guys really want me to lay out the MVPD, whatever we're going to do on MVPD, in detail right now, don't you? I think that's a question that you'll probably see dealt with.
Lynn Stanton from Telecommunications Reports.
Hi, Lynn.
In the open internet proceeding, carriers, and especially wireless carriers, argue that network management is really complicated, they are in the best position to make these decisions, and they shouldn't be impeded by FCC second guessing. Does this 911 outage report call into question that argument that they're in the best way to look at network management, since this sort of suggests that maybe they're not managing things that great, at least in terms of third parties?
I think what that report focuses on is that increasingly in an IP world, various activities are being outsourced. Yes, you can call them network management issues. The fact that it is outsourced does not mean you get to wipe your hands of it, wash your hands of it. And that's the issue that we're going to be dealing with in the follow-on to that report.
Phil Goldstein from Fierce Wireless. A couple weeks ago, the FCC, along with Greenhill, put out a report that basically detailed a pitch to broadcasters about why they should participate in the incentive auction, what they can gain from it. I assume that process is now being kicked off, and the FCC is, having meetings with broadcasters throughout the country. What milestones or information should we be looking at over the next few months to determine how well that pitch is going and how broadcasters are responding?
I don't think that, Phil, you're going to know how broadcasters are responding until the auction happens. I mean, this is a marketplace that we're talking about here. We're creating a marketplace. We're trying to provide information that's relevant to that marketplace so that people can make decisions. But I think it is the marketplace that speaks for the marketplace.
Paul Kirby with TR Daily. I have 4 MVPD questions, each with 3 subparts. To follow up on something Phil asked, the Incentive Auction Task Force said they're looking soon for an NPRM to prepare an NPRM for the Commission dealing with the single unlicensed channel, which at one time was called naturally occurring channel. And then secondly, the PN that we're looking for to seek comments on the auction rules. Are those 2 items, do you think you might be putting them on the agenda for the November meeting?
I'm not going to violate the sunshine process, Paul, by talking about what the agenda is going to be for the November meeting. I will say that we have an agenda that we established when I came in for the auction, and we are sticking with that agenda. Those are clearly key points on that agenda. Thanks.
Ed, did you have a question?
You really like Kansas City what?
None. My team, my fallback team, my fallback team did not make it to the World Series. Shows you how good I am at picking baseball teams. Well, let me respond to one thing that you didn't ask. That I'm surprised. Oh, we have one back there. We get you guys to ask. Okay, so here it is. Pressure's on.
I don't know if that's this.
What was this? The Carsoni, right? The answer is right.
Have you had personal communications with the president or the White House regarding the net neutrality issues?
I have not had personal communications with the president. I have kept the White House staff informed, just as I have kept congressional staff informed as to what the process is. But let me use that as an opportunity to address another topic, that there has been a lot of interpretation about what the president said last week, and I wanted to just be clear that my position is unchanged, and that the president and I agree and have always agreed on the importance of an open internet to create, as he says, the next Google, the next Facebook. And that I have tried, when I've been meeting with you and in commission meetings, to express that. So I thought it might be helpful that I reiterate some of the things that I've said. So, for instance, the president said that he is opposed to paid prioritization. And when we rolled out the NPRM at that meeting, I said, quote, if prioritization hurts the virtuous circle, or is anti-competitive, or anti-consumer, or anti-innovative, or degrades the network, it is dead on arrival. I think that's a statement on paid prioritization. The president then also went on the other day and he said, quote, we're not creating 2 or 3 or 4 tiers of the internet. At the open meeting where we, again, rolled out the NPRM, I said, quote, the prospect of a gatekeeper choosing winners and losers is unacceptable, unquote. And then a week or so later, when I was testifying before the Energy and Commerce Committee and was asked a similar question, I said, quote, I don't think there should be haves and have-nots, unquote. So my position is unchanged, and I believe that on the important question of paid prioritization and opportunity that is created by an open internet, the president and I are in agreement. And have always been.
Paul, did you have a question?
Hi, Mr. Chairman.
Hi, Paul. How come they don't give you a seat up here? I mean, you know.
Who paid for these seats?
It's my microphone. I paid for it. Okay.
Mr. Chairman, as you know, there's been some debate within the industry about 5G, what 5G is, what 5G will mean for the future of mobile wireless communication. As someone who is steeped in the evolution of 2G, 3G, and 4G, can you talk a little bit about what 5G means to you?
One of the things, I mean, it's a terrific question because I do have feelings about that because I have spent a little time worrying about this in the past. I think one of the reasons that we are the world leader in 4G is because this agency made a decision against industrial policy and saying this is the way it will be, because that tends to freeze innovation and freeze creativity. And so what we want to do, and I hope what I was trying to make clear when I said I don't care what they call it, whether it's millimeter wave, 5G, kumquats, I don't care what you call this. There is a next generation of spectrum capabilities that is going to define a series of next generation services. And what we do when we open the NOI is say, okay, help us answer those kinds of questions. But we don't want to be prejudging that today.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
No. If you have,
Let's try though.
if you have specific questions on the items, we'll have the staff up here to talk about those.
Okay, let's just go in the order of the meeting. So for the siting, any questions on the siting facility? Okay, come on up, wireless. Roger.
The rules you guys streamlined as far as siting new equipment, does that apply to both, you know, what we think of like big heavyweight towers, or does that just apply to like distributed antenna service, you know, that sort of thing, or both?
The item today is focused on co-locations.
Right.
And streamlining the ability to attach antennas to existing structures and letting out some contours around that.
But I thought there was something about with the 90-day, the shot clock, that you guys made some clarification on the shot clock, and that's what I'm sorry for the way I'm asking the question.
No, it's a little confusing because there are several shot clocks and different application of the shot clocks under different statutory provisions. So under 332, there's a shot clock that's already in place. I think it's in the team will have to keep me honest. I think it's 150 days for a regular tower and 90 days for a co-location. And those shot clocks are staying in place. We didn't make any changes. We clarified that they do apply to DAS and other types of facilities, that the shot clock does apply under 332. But we also set up a shot clock of sorts under 6409, which was in the Spectrum Act, which said if a jurisdiction doesn't act within 60 days, it will be deemed granted, subject to certain rules and conditions.
Okay.
Am I missing anything there, guys?
Okay, thanks.
Any of those on siting? Okay, so then I think you guys need to stay around for 5G is next, correct?
So called 5G.
Kumquats.
A better term.
Kumquats. Who's John? Are you doing this? Okay.
Well, I'll do it.
Questions? Who has a question?
Are there specific spectrum bands above 24 gigahertz that are going to be part of this inquiry?
Yeah, so we'll have a list of specific bands starting at 24 gigahertz and going up. They'll be explained in detail in the NOI. We hope to get that out today, so you'll see that.
Is there an upper limit on where that stops?
We see comment on specific bands and then see comment on bands above 95 gigahertz generally.
Paul?
In your presentation earlier, you note technologies, advanced technologies. Just for clarification, are there specific technologies in the NOI that you see comment on? Are we talking about specific antennas?
Yes, there are specific technologies. There are, in the TAC process, they sort of spoke with a lot of technology companies, and then our staff has been speaking with a lot of technology companies, and there are clearly certain technologies that are at the forefront of what people are thinking would allow the higher frequencies to be used for mobile use. So, for example, I think Charlie Oliver mentioned the
the antenna arrays being kind of a key technology, but there are a number of them and advances in processing. So we ask about a number of those specific technologies. We also ask the wide open, what other technologies should we be thinking about? And I think just to kind of echo what the chairman said about, this being market driven and not being, the commission defining 5G, I think people ought to keep in mind what we're trying to do with this fact finding is understand what is the range of technologies and capabilities that could be out there. Ultimately, if we then make the next step to try to propose rules in certain bands, we would likely move to write rules that are flexible and can accommodate a wide range of technologies, which is our practice in the United States.
And I guess the main technology that you're looking at is the antenna, these little millimeter
that
antennas.
seems to be one of the main technologies. That's kind of the use of adaptive antennas, antenna arrays is one of the key things people are talking about, but there are a number of other ones as well, and a lot of it also comes back to some of the other aspects of deployment, like the density of the network and the backhaul availability and so forth.
I have one more question.
Go ahead.
Understanding that this is an NOI and you'll be asking a lot of questions and the public will come with their input, do you have any concerns at this point about the spectrum? Have you come to this process with any preconceived concerns or worries about the application of mobile wireless in this band of spectrum?
No, I don't think we have preconceived ideas on this, other than we want to create opportunities for the technology to advance and to enable mobile wireless to continue to grow. So I think you'll find when the item is released that it's rich in ideas, in discussing the research that's been done so far, and identifying what are the areas that we should be thinking about to make sure that the opportunities we create for the future are the right ones.
Okay. Thank you, Julie.
Further questions on this? Okay, I think it's inmate calling next, please.
No questions about 6G or 7G?
Inmate calling questions.
Lynn, I think you raised your hand first.
Lynn Stanton, TR Daily. Are there any tentative conclusions in the FNPRM?
No, I don't believe there are any tentative conclusions that I'm aware of. I think we, in an accommodation in working with the other offices, we moved from tentative conclusions to seeking comment on a whole host of areas.
Would an adverse decision by the Court of Appeals on the merits in the pending challenge of last year's order implicate your ability to do any of the things that are contemplated by the FNPRM?
I think that's kind of hard to prejudge. Depends on what the court would say, but we don't think so. We didn't write this with an anticipation for what the court may or may not do. I think we are seeking to move forward with a more comprehensive solution for the entire ICS market, but our anticipation is to be able to move forward.
And I've got one more.
Go ahead.
When you talk about moving to a more competitive market approach, just to be clear, the market would still consist of one provider selected by a facility that's not actually paying the charges, right? The inmate's only choice would be whether or not to make a call. They don't get a choice of providers to place the call with.
Well, as Commissioner O'Reilly raised, that is a question that is now reflected in the item at his request to seek about competition by having multiple providers in facilities. I think what has come out in the record is from across the board, the main problem in the ICS marketplace today is that competition is, as you noted, in seeking to get that access to the facility. And that competition today is driven by who can pay the highest site commission cost. We ask a lot of questions related to if you were to eliminate site commissions, would that change the competitive landscape? That today focuses on who pays the highest commission, but rather than focus on something else, on costs, rates paid by end users, on service, on security, on all of the other elements. Would that drive a different landscape, a competitive landscape that aligns sort of the goal of just, reasonable, fair rates with the competitive process?
I guess I'm just questioning, the rate paid by the inmate would seem to me to be at the very bottom of the stack of issues that the facility itself that's doing the selection of who gets the contract would ever care about. You know, it doesn't come out of their pocketbook, so why would that ever be an issue they would care about unless some outside force were forcing them to worry about that, as opposed to site commissions or kickbacks, whatever you want to call them, or
But that's exactly, I think, the questions that are raised in the item, which is today, because site commissions drive the competitive process, what would happen if site commissions were eliminated? And I think there is some evidence in the record that certain states have moved in the direction of eliminating site commissions, and rates have come down, and come down dramatically. Is that a process that could work? Would that solve the overall ICS problem generally?
Thank you very much.
Others?
Kerry? I'm Kerry Murakami from Communications Daily. Can you make the case for why the legal authority exists? I mean, is it because the inmate phones are considered pay phones, or can you explain that to me?
Well, we ask. All I'll say on the legal authority issue right now is we ask questions on legal authority. There have been plenty in the comments in the proceeding itself, pros and cons about whether the commission has legal authority to move forward. We think the statute talks about interstate and intrastate rates. Site commissions have such an enormous impact. Site commissions are paid out of those rates. So there are questions that are raised in the further notice regarding our legal authority.
I thought Pi had said that he wanted those questions included, but they weren't included. Or did I misunderstand?
Again, as we said, we don't have any tentative conclusions in the item, and we're asking, I think, broad questions that encompass all of the concerns raised by all of the commissioners. So I would argue that the item is written in such a manner that parties who have concerns or comments on our legal authority in all areas have ample room to provide those comments.
If I promise not to hold you to it, could you give us a guess as to when the text of the order of FNPRM might be out?
I would just say soon.
I'm sorry. So you do ask questions about whether or not the FCC has authority in these areas?
We have questions about our legal authority, yes.
Thank you.
One more?
Yes. Was there ever any talk, or is there anything in the further notice of proposal we're making that maybe would seek to come to like maybe a middle ground between having no site commissions versus maybe a cap on the percentage or the amount that can be paid as part of site commissions?
What the item asks is site commissions as a category. It's undefined in terms of what is in there. Site commissions can pay for, or they are just. I'll take a step back. In our previous item, we noted that site commissions were not a cost of providing ICS, but they were an apportionment of profits between the providers and the facilities. To the degree that facilities have costs in the provision of ICS, costs directly related to ICS service, we are asking questions about how facilities would recover those costs. So to the degree that you're thinking about site commissions in that context, I think that is clearly in there.
I see. And in terms of the ancillary fees, they can make up as much as 40%, from what I understand. Is there anything in the NPR, in the further notice proposal we're making that would cap the amount of percentages that ancillary costs could go up to?
We have a number of proposals from industry about how to deal with ancillary charges. There are cap proposals. There are proposals from industry itself that talk about caps or elimination of certain ancillary fees. The Alabama PSC has their proposal in place. We seek comment on all of that.
Just to clarify, the ancillary fees are like the call set up one time, the fee,
They
that
could-
kind of thing? Or
They could be credit card processing fees. They could be regulatory fees. They could be a wide range of fees. There's almost too numerous to list.
Okay, thank you.
Any questions on the 911 item? Presentation, that is? Okay, Lynn? All right. So, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Okay, now that's just us. I'm going to lay out the detailed roadmap for MVPD.
Okay.
Not really, just kidding.
Good start.
Yeah.
I guess I thought maybe people were going to walk up with you, so I was trying to wait.
Yeah, no, go ahead.
Okay, and I can't find the particular table in here that I'm thinking of, but during the presentation there was one in which you said there were 4 of these multi-state outages this year and none in previous years. Is that correct?
Well,
And-
let me put a little finer point on that, that there were 4 outages that shared the common elements of they were not weather-induced, they were sunny day factors, and they impacted at least a state or more.
I'm sorry, impacted at least what?
They impacted at least a whole state or more than a state.
So I wanted to ask, and you did touch on this, but if you just had a little bit any more thoughts on why it is you think there was such a dramatic increase, and do we attribute this just to the NG 911 transition, or?
It's not just to Next Generation 911 itself. It's really more of an impact of the way that communication technologies are evolving more broadly. What used to be an analog function in a switch that was in an end office that supported a county PSAP, over time, the communications has allowed the ability to perform that digitally, not just once for a metropolitan area or for a whole state, but now you can do that halfway across the country in Colorado. You just couldn't do that effectively 25 years ago. So that trend to be able to remote critical functions has, in some cases, added redundancy because you can do things in more than one place and stay up. It has supported wonderful abilities of PSAPs to be able to back up other PSAPs, but it can also allow operators to lower their costs by not having to keep as many manned facilities around as they used to. And it's that trend that we saw reflected in the April multi-state outage, a similar trend in that carrier-wide outage that I talked about, that wireless carrier. Vermont reports the same things associated with how the service is provided for their statewide Next Generation 911, and similarly Hawaii. In fact, while we didn't go into full detail on Hawaii, that's interesting, and I encourage you to talk to Thera Bradshaw. They've experienced just this year alone 8 different outages totaling 20 hours of downtime in Hawaii from their Next Generation 911 implementation. So it's not Next Generation 911 itself, but it's the technologies that have in fact enabled Next Generation 911 that aren't in all cases being responsibly deployed by the stakeholders.
So as I understand you're saying, it's because they're doing this remotely, it means any one mistake impacts potentially many, many more people.
No, not just remotely. It's the concentration of the capability in one location.
Well, yeah, but doing it remotely allows you to concentrate, doesn't it? I mean,
Well, but you could also do it remotely around many, many locations.
Yes.
So when was the last time you did a Google search? it works a lot, right? It worked for me in Iraq. Google was never down when I was in Iraq deployed. But Google has multiple nodes distributed across the larger internet fabric. So if anyone's down, you don't know about it. They shard all the information associated with any data that's put in one of their data centers and ensure that it is never stored in just one data center. It's stored in multiple data centers. That's not the case in 911, where operators have, in fact, concentrated to one or two facilities some very critical functions.
So, and obviously you're referring these issues to the CISRIC, or suggesting that the FCC refer them to the CISRIC, but do you have thoughts, or does the report have thoughts? I mean, is that the way you think it should go, that there should be a requirement to have backup data centers in case one?
The CISRIC is only one of the tools at our disposal to address this problem, and as you heard the chairman say, but really all the commissioners, we need to move forward with dispatch. So I expect that we'll utilize the CISRIC, but we'll also utilize the full range of our proceedings and our interface with the ecosystem to come up with proposals. As far as the concentration of the equipment, we do not want to prescriptively begin to, from the FCC, define what the right engineering standard is for the number of facilities, or for the how those should be in fact made more robust and resilient. We do believe, however, that if we sharpen and clarify the accountability for who's responsible for that, is the carrier supporting the PSAP? Is it the third-party provider? Is it defined by the contract relationship, or is it defined by the obligation of the carrier to provide service? Those are the kinds of things, in addition to best practices in the CISRIC, that I expect us to explore in detail around the rest of the proceedings.
Thank you very much.
Anybody else have a question?
I think you may have answered, but I'm going to answer this, but I'm going to ask it again. So is there something inherently wrong with just having one or two call routing centers, or whatever we call them, these things, like happened to Colorado and Florida? I mean, do we need 6 or 10? I don't exactly know how to ask that question, but do you understand what I'm trying to get at?
I absolutely do. I grew up in Southern California. I have fond memories of the San Fernando earthquake in, I think it was 1969. And I remember at the time, regularly as a kid, descriptions of, hey, that San Andreas Fault, at some point, the part of California we were in may be an island off of the rest of California. After an earthquake, you want 911 to work. If all of the lines east of the San Andreas Fault are no longer in place, you don't want 911 capabilities in and around the Los Angeles metropolitan area to no longer work. So I do think we need something better than a concentration of capabilities in one or two locations around the entire United States, because it just might not be there. When you lay on top of the sunny day, stuff breaks with real-world disasters. Miami's kind of prone to hurricanes. Had a hurricane come at the same time, we would not have had that failover, perhaps. So I think there needs to be more.
Can I have a follow-up?
One more.
Sorry. In the case in Colorado that was cited, would even having multiple nodes or calling centers even helped, unless they were operated by different vendors who had different coding? Because presumably if one vendor were operating them all, they'd be using the same software.
Yeah, so I'm just going to give you a one example of how it might be approached differently, but I do not at all want this example to mean that this is what we're advocating, or that this is the only way to skin the cat. But a lot really has gone on with technology in the last couple of years, and there's been a real movement to virtualize servers. And the ability to virtualize the servers that failed in Colorado in this case, and put that in multiple locations in the cloud, is really fairly inexpensive. So would the vendor have had to build facilities in all these other locations? Probably not. They could have had additional servers that were load balanced to, in fact, if any one of them went down, the routes were advertised for the number of other virtual servers that could have supported the same function. So that's kind of where I'm going with we need to take the great resiliency of the internet. There are n factorial ways to get from Washington State to Colorado. It's designed for nuclear blasts. And ensure that in the layers above transport that we have a similar degree of resiliency there, and don't in the application layer inadvertently create these single points of failure.
Thank you very much. Okay, thanks.